All righty. It appears, I think we're on. Yeah. So, good morning. Welcome. This is the Adult One Bible Study at Grace Baptist Church. My name is Norm Ellis. And today you've tuned in to session number 11 of our studies. And session number 11 is called It Is Finished. And we're going to be talking about the crucifixion of Christ. And yes, I know it's not Easter. On Easter, we talked about the resurrection of Christ and the woman who came to the tomb finding it empty. But we kind of skipped over this part because we're going to come back to it. Now is the day we come back to it. So we're going to be talking about these four areas: raised, planned, honored, and finished. And this is in John chapter 19. So please have your Bibles ready for that. And if you are following along in our study book, we are on session number 11, which starts on page 100 and goes to page 108. So, for those of you at home who cannot see, here's my prop today. What is this, you ask? It's a red bucket. Is there significance to the red color? No. The significance is it's a bucket. All right.
You sure it's red?
Well, it is red, yes, I know that.
You sure?
Well, it looks like it's red. So, we're going to begin here, and let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time we have to share your word, Lord, to learn from these words, and especially from the account we see in John, and just help us to understand more thoroughly what it meant when Jesus was on that cross, and when he paid the debt for us, and when he said it was finished, Lord, and what it meant. Thank you so much for all you've done for us, and I just pray to be with those that are on their way here, bring them here safely. Be with those that are sick, help them get better, Lord. And also pray for those that are watching from afar, Lord, online. Thank you for those that are able to tune in today. And I just pray you watch over us in your Son's name. Amen. So, glad to have you all with us today. We're kind of sparse in the classroom. I'm hopeful that we'll get some more people coming in. Those of you online, I'm sure there's multitudes out there, right? Just joking. But we've been going through the Gospel of John, and actually last quarter we went through the first half of John, and so we're finishing up this quarter with the last half of John. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So I was supposed to have a poster up here, so imagine, if you will, a poster that says last words, okay? So I'm going to read some last words. Before they died, people will say things that are profound. Sometimes they'll say things that are interesting. Sometimes they'll say things that are kind of off the wall. And so I'm going to list a couple of them here for you. And the first quote is, "I am bored with it all." Then the person died. Another one said, "They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." That's the last words this person said. Another one said, "I feel something that is not of this earth." Another one said, "I am going over the valley." And another one said, "I have a terrific headache." Another person said, "You know, that picture is awful dusty." So, who do you think said those words? Well, you're probably not going to guess unless you happen to know some of them. The first one was by Winston Churchill. Before he died, he said, "I'm bored with it all." Another person who I quoted was a Union general during the Civil War, John Sedgwick. He said this just before being shot by a sniper in 1864. He said, "They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." Well, apparently they were able to hit him. Mozart said, "I feel something that is not of this earth." And Babe Ruth said, "I'm going over the valley." Now, normally you go over the mountain, you go into the valley. But, Babe Ruth said, "I'm going over the valley." Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, he said, "I have a terrific headache." Jesse James, the notorious outlaw, he said, "That picture is awful dusty." Now, why would Jesse James have said that? Well, apparently he was looking at a picture, and he was shot from behind. As he was turning to straighten the picture, and he commented, "Boy, this picture is dusty," and then somebody got him from behind. So, do we put much stock in these kind of things sometimes? Last words, what do you think? Yes or no? What do you think, Steve? Last words? You put a lot of stock in last words that somebody may say before they die?
Not really.
Not really? Yeah. Sometimes they're profound, sometimes they're like, good morning, good
morning.
with us.
Might remember Scott. He's
Scott.
with Options 360, and he's here to speak to us today as
All right.
our climactic ending of that campaign giving
All
and
right.
prayer and emphasis.
Well, glad to have you with us. We're a little sparse today. Is Tina? Oh, there she
She's
is.
here, yeah. So we got, this is my dad, Norm. He's our Sunday school teacher. This is my brother, Steve. Not literal brother, but, spiritual brother.
Figuratively.
That's right.
Nobody wants
You know me since I was young. Same with Tina.
That's true.
Are you going to join us later, or are you busy?
It depends on visitation. So,
Oh, okay.
not visitation. Depends on
Reading.
reading. So, I might.
All
All
right.
right, see y'all soon. God bless.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'm sorry, your first name again?
Scott.
Scott. I should know that. I have a cousin named Scott, one of my
right.
most beloved cousins.
Yours is Norm.
Norm, yes.
Are you?
What?
Yes.
I know what?
You are his father?
Yes, I am.
Oh.
Indeed.
All right.
I have to claim him. Anyway, today we're in John chapter 19, and there are a copy of my handouts in and amongst the seats here, so you might find one there. We were just talking about last words. Somebody will say their last words and then they die, right? And there's some interesting ones we talked about. Winston Churchill said, "I'm bored with it all," and then he died. Another interesting one was, "I have a terrible headache," said Franklin Roosevelt, and then he died. I think is an interesting one is this Union General John Sedgwick during the Civil War. Oh yes, thank you for doing that. I appreciate that. During the Civil War, he was shot by a sniper, but right before that, he said, I don't think they could hit an elephant at this distance. And it was his last words. Anyway, so we sometimes put stock by last words, sometimes we don't. It's just kind of a curiosity. You probably wonder, why is there a red bucket on the floor here? Go ahead, say it, Tina. Why is there a red bucket there, Norm?
Well, normally it gets pennies in it.
Oh, yes, that's true.
From
They're
Vacation
VBS.
Bible School.
That's true. But not today. No, you don't have to worry about that. Today, it's serving another purpose. Have you ever heard of a bucket list? A bucket list. What's a bucket list? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before I forget, I have some verses to hand out. If you'd like to and then you can read it in your own translation if you want to. Would you like to read a verse for us?
Sure.
Okay, I'll give you that one there. Matter of fact, that's a shorty. Would you like to take two? I'll let you take that one.
Oh, man,
Here's two shorties
Trial
for
by
you.
fire today, Scott. Trial by fire.
Well, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, so don't complain.
Oh, okay.
Error. You can have 6. And even half a dozen.
And you'll see there's numbers by them, and hopefully I don't have them out of order. We'll see here in a moment. But anyway, so we have a bucket on the floor here, and one of my most favorite movies, comedic movies, was It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. Have you ever watched It's a Mad, 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 Mad World?
Yes.
5 mads.
Something like that. Well, there's a scene in it at the very beginning where this gangster, he just got out of prison. He's running away because they're following him because he knows where the money is. The money that he stole, right? And so he's going down the canyon and he crashes. And he gets thrown out and he's laying there all broken. These people who saw the chase going on, they went down there to see him. They were totally unrelated to the officers that were chasing him, because the officers, he'd gotten away from them, and these people. And these people go down to him, and he's saying some last words. It's into the W, the big W. And then his feet conflict, and he kicks this bucket, and the bucket goes down the hill. Very symbolic. What does it mean you kick the bucket?
You died.
Died.
You're dead. That's my prop for the day. Okay, so we have something today we call a bucket list. What do you think a bucket list is?
Things you want to do before you die.
Before you kick the bucket. Yeah. Now we're not going to get into where the kick the bucket came from. There's a couple different stories about that. Some of them aren't that great, so I'm not going to even bother. But do you have a bucket list? Anybody here have a bucket list? There's something you want to do in your life for whatever reason before you go on to your reward, right? What would be on your bucket? I tell you what was on my bucket list, and I've taken it off now, was I wanted to climb up to the rim of Mount St. Helens. I don't think I can make it anymore. My knees are not what they used to be. Getting to 67, you might say, no, you don't look 67. Well, thank you if you say that. But I don't think I can make it up to the rim. You know, I'd love to do it, get my camera up there and just take pictures, but the only way I'm going to make it up to the rim of Mount St. Helens is probably by helicopter. I don't know.
Well,
The best way to be by
drop
helicopter.
you in?
Yeah,
Yeah.
just drop me in by helicopter. But that would be on my bucket list. And there's probably some other things. One thing I have on my immediate bucket list is I want to finish this boat I've been working on. This 12-foot aluminum boat used to be my grandma and grandpa's, and I have very fond memories of going fishing, especially with my grandma. And then she died, and the boat went to my mom and dad, and my dad died, and then my mom died. Well, unbeknownst to me, the boat was still in the backyard. It was sitting like this, upside down, against a tree. The trailer was just over there, and it was nothing but pieces. It rusted away. But the aluminum boat was still in good shape. So I got the aluminum boat, and I've resealed it, and I've repainted it, and my goal is to get it finished. I have to work on the stern. It's kind of messed up. But I'm going to take the grandkids and go fishing.
Nice.
So anyways, anybody else have a bucket list item like that? Or something similar? Doesn't have to be doom and gloom type of story.
I have not seen the New England states.
Oh, you want to go up to New England? It's beautiful. When I was in the Air Force, we were going to Iceland, and our plane had a problem. I forgot what it was. It wasn't a serious problem. C-130 had to stop
Engine
it.
fell off.
No, the engine did not fall off. We were the maintainers of that aircraft. It was a good aircraft, but we had some problem. I forgot, a minor problem, hydraulic pump or something. So they stopped in, I want to say Maine, but that's probably not it. What's the state up there that's known for its fall foliage? Well,
Isn't
Vermont?
no, it's not Vermont, but it's
New
Vermont's
Hampshire?
no, it's like Maine or something like that. Anyway, whatever. What's lobster known for? Maine. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was Maine, and so we stopped at this little obscure guard base in Maine, and we were there for about a week because it took a while to get the part. And we finally got the part, and we flew on to Iceland. But it was beautiful because it was the fall. So I was just saying that to say that's a good one. I mean, I took some pictures and stuff. It was beautiful. I could not believe they have a lot more deciduous trees than we have out here. Anyway, there's a lot of things like that, right? We want to do before we're accomplished. So we're going to talk about something here that is really important to us as Christians, right? And that's what did Christ say before he died, and why maybe he said these things, right? We don't want unfinished business, do we? We don't want unfinished. Unfortunately, we're going to die. There's going to be some things that will be unfinished. I know that, but we don't really want to have anything big unfinished. So we're going to look into what happened to Christ on the cross. Crucifixion was the most painful and degrading punishment in the ancient world. In some ways, it's been around for centuries, but the Romans had perfected it. And by the time the Romans were done, 500 years of working on it, they had it perfected. This was not at the end of the Roman Empire, obviously, but they were doing a pretty good job of it. So we're going to talk a little bit about today is that aspect of it. Matter of fact, right now let's talk about a little bit about crucifixion. In your handout, on page 1, I have a little brief thing about crucifixion, but I've got a little more detail on another thing I worked up. So I'm going to read this one for you guys. Historically, crucifixion, when you think about crucifixion, the precursor to it was impalement. Now, you may not know what that is, but it was a horrible, horrible way to die. It was fairly quick. You would be impaled upon this pole, usually right up the middle into the, it was a bad thing. Bad thing. And the Assyrians were primarily the ones who started using this around 700 BC. The Persians took it, and they used it. If you remember the story of Esther, Queen Esther, and it was Haman, was the bad guy? I think it was Haman.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds about right.
He built the gallows for the other guy, and the Esther's uncle or whatever it was. It turned out the gallows were a big pole back then. They called them gallows because we think of hanging, of capital punishment. But anyway, so he ended up being on it. The bad guy ended up being on this thing. So we know that the Persians had it also around 600 BC. Similar methods were used by the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, and even the Greeks, although the Greeks usually opposed impalement. But we see recorded in 479 BC that they nailed a Persian general to a plank, and then they hung him up, and he died. So this was probably one of the first of what we think the modern idea of crucifixion would be. The Romans then came to power, and they absorbed the concept of crucifixion. This is around 300 BC. They went on to perfect it, and it was the most brutal form of capital punishment. It sometimes took days of horrible pain because the idea was to make that person survive as long as possible before he died. And so that's what they did. It was a gruesome way to publicly execute criminals and dissenters so that all others would be deterred from breaking the law. They would put them up on these trees or poles and nail them up there, and they'd leave them there for days, and it'd be on the public roads. I'm getting ahead of myself here. But they would, after they died, they would leave them there, and the buzzards and stuff would pick them up. It was really, really horrible. But it was an example to everyone who would come in down that public road of what Rome could do to you. Anyway, prior to his execution by crucifixion, Jesus was struck, beaten, scourged is what the word I think they use in a lot of translations, with a whip. And this whip was made of braided leather thongs. It had metal pieces and I think bone, sharp bone, and things like that inside of woven into these strands. And when they beat you with it, and they would beat you normally 39 lashes and no more, because somewhere it said 40 was the maximum. So in case they made a mistake, they'd stop at 39. But that was the Jews. It wasn't the Romans. The Romans would beat you until they thought it was enough. And, because they wanted you to be alive when they nailed you up on the cross. They didn't want you to die. Many people would die just from the scourging. When they did this to Jesus, very probably chunks of flesh were torn from his body. You could see the veins, the muscles, the sinews, and maybe even the bowels were sometimes exposed. The object was to bring this person as close to death as possible while actually killing them. However, many victims would die from this horrible beating before being crucified. You can see why, right? A crown, in the case of Jesus, they mocked him, and part of the mocking was this crown of thorns. Now, when we think of thorns, we think of what? Blackberry thorns that are about this long? These thorns were not that long. These thorns were like this. I had a tree one time in my yard that had thorns similar, like that long. Horrible thing, horrible thing. In the Middle East, the ones they would probably use for this were very long things. And they wove him into a crown, stuck it on his head, and then they hit him on the head. So you can imagine what that would do with that situation. So he suffered being struck in the head and all these other things while being mocked with a purple robe on and all these things. Traumatic pain, excessive blood loss, dehydration would have sent Christ's body into shock before the nails were even hammered into his wrists and feet. Shock caused something called pericarditis, which is inflammation of the sac around the heart. And it would cause stabbing pains in the chest. These large, rough nails, actually they were more like spikes, and they were not round like we think. They're not uniform, they were kind of squarish, very, very crude. They were driven into his wrists and feet. Now, I know it says palms or hands in a lot of translations, but in actuality, the hand was from the tip of the fingers to the elbow. So that was all considered a hand. But they've done experiments with cadavers, there we go. And they found that if you did do that here, it would tear loose. So very possibly it was done right there where the strongest part would have been. So that's why most people believe it was probably through the wrist area. Anyway, it was designed, they put him in a position that would cause the most discomfort possible. And he would have to the victim would have to continually push up against his feet that were nailed also to breathe. Can you imagine that? It'd be horrible. So you'd get less and less oxygen, and less of the carbon dioxide would be expelled. So what would that cause? This buildup of carbon dioxide would basically cause your organs to start failing. And remember, he's bled out a lot too. He was actually so weak that he couldn't carry his crossbeam, that you had to carry your own crossbeam from where you were in the city to outside the city, because they didn't want the city to be unclean because of that. And there was a reason for that. So it would take them outside the city in this particular place called Golgotha, and the shape of the skull was seen on this hill, they think. They theorized that he took between 3 to 6 hours before he finally died. Inflammation and fluid built up in his organs, and they were under pressure because of the buildup there, and they could not function properly. And eventually Christ's physical systems were shutting down due to that cardiac and respiratory or asphyxiation. And because of this shock and stuff that the body was going through, that's probably what killed him at that point. But it's interesting to notice, he decided when to die. He decided when to die. He said, "It is finished." Then he gave up the spirit. So Roman soldiers from the execution, they always make sure. They were very good at what they did. They prided themselves on what they did. They want this detail probably had 4 people assigned to this area. These three they were killing. And there was a centurion that was in charge of the detail. And to make sure, they took his spear and went up and drove it into his chest, his stomach and chest area, and probably did this to pull it out again. And out came blood and water, we know. And there was no reaction. He was dead. So if you swoon and come back from that, like some people try to say, you're a pretty interesting person. That's not going to happen. They made sure of what they did. He was dead. Anyway, so that's just an overview of that. Let's look at the verses here, realizing what he went through before he even got on the cross, obviously. So these first 6 verses, I want you to listen to the details of the crucifixion of Christ. And actually, we're going to look at, I think, 17 and 18 first. Who's got number 1?
I have number 1.
So yours is split in 2. You can probably see that, right?
I do see that.
All right. I didn't mess that up. Where's my verses? I lost my verses. Oh, here it is. So go ahead and read the first couple of verses. And we're going to be, like I said, listening for details of the crucifixion. Go ahead.
All right. So he then handed him over to them to be crucified.
That's Pilate.
They took Jesus, therefore, and went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. There they crucified him, with him and 2 other men, one on either side, and Jesus in between.
Okay, so we talked about this already, but part of the punishment was to carry part of the cross yourself. And these places of execution usually had the poles already set in the ground. And so you'd carry your cross member all the way down the route to the place of execution. I think the Catholics call that the Via Dolorosa, something like that. And they have stations of the cross and all that. That's a lot of tradition and ritual they've added in. And I was going to try to find it on the map. They don't really know for sure the exact location, but it was outside of the city. We know that. And it was in a place that was called Golgotha. And it had the shape of a skull. And there's one that kind of fits that description pretty well. And I'm not going to see it on my map here, but it was outside of the city on a main road. We know that as well. Anyway, I was going to try to find it there, and I forgot to do it ahead of time. Here's one. Golgotha's traditional location. Now, this was not part of the city at the time. This was considered outside of the city. But this is one of the locations they think is the traditional one right here. That was the one I was trying to find. And so there's this hill, this little, not a big hill, but a hill, nevertheless, that looked a little bit like a skull. And to this day, I think it has some resemblance to that. So that's why most people think it was there. So additionally, what was Jesus crucified by himself? No, right?
He had company.
He had company, right. There's one on his right and one on his left as well. We see in Isaiah 53:12 an interesting verse here, and I think, is that me?
No, that's me.
You've got it. Can you read that for us, please?
Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he himself bore the sin of many, and interceded for the transgressors.
Okay, so in that particular verse, we know that Isaiah is speaking prophetically, right? We know that he's speaking of what's going to happen to Messiah. And what do we see just in that verse there? It says, therefore I will allow him a portion with the great. So he is a great person. We know that, right? But it says also that he will divide the booty with the strong. Okay, and then it goes on, because he's poured out himself to death, he was numbered with the transgressors. So to be numbered with the transgressors, he was crucified with transgressors. The people who he was killed alongside of were robbers, thieves, murderers, those kind of people. I don't know if they know exactly who these two were, but they could very well have been followers of Barabbas. That was one thing I was reading in one of the commentaries, is that Barabbas, we know from the time we talked about this before, was the one who was supposed to die, and Jesus took his place. He was an insurrectionist and a murderer. Some people think he was the ringleader and they're like cleaning up this group of people, and he was one of the ones. And that's why Pilate offered, hey, I'll release Jesus instead of Barabbas. How about that? He was thinking they'd go for that, right? They didn't go for that. They wanted Jesus dead. So they'd rather have this insurrectionist murderer free instead of the king of the Jews, right? Pretty sad if you think about that aspect of it. But that was because of the Jewish leaders had influenced the crowd so much in that direction, it looks like. Anyway, it says that yet he himself bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. Again, Isaiah is speaking prophetically of Messiah. That's what Messiah would do. Did he bear our sins?
Most definitely.
Yeah. Did he intercede for us? He did, didn't he? Any comments on these parts here that you want to bring up? There's been a lot of movies and depictions of the crucifixion, right? Have you ever seen one before? Maybe more than one, right? There's a real famous one lately, last several years now, by what's that guy's name? I forgot the guy's name. You know what I'm talking about. He played Mad Max and a lot of different things like that. Anyway, it was an interesting portrayal. The Passion, that's right, The Passion it was called. The Passion of Christ, I think. And I can't remember the guy's name, it's escaping me still.
Mel Gibson.
Mel Gibson, there you go. Mel Gibson. Anyway, it was his film. He didn't portray Christ, but it was his film. That, and there's many others that you've probably seen. What impressed you most when you watched that? Anything stand out to you? Not that particular movie, but any of those movies.
For me, it just kind of makes it just a little bit more real.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? It's one thing to read, but
Correct.
seeing it,
Right.
and there were some things that I just couldn't look.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I just can't. I can't see. I can't.
A movie engages more than just one sense, right? And you're right. Reading, of course, when you read, your mind is more active on it. But still, in a movie, you see, you hear, you know, the colors, the sounds and stuff. If it's done right, you feel like you're there. And that can be very disturbing when we realize what Christ went through. And why did he go through it? He went through it just for us, right? The horror and the shame is something that should grab us when we watch this. Because, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but all the pictures you see of Christ being crucified, you see this nice little wrap around his waist, right? They didn't have that. He was stripped of all his clothing. And many times it was done before they marched him from the trial to the site, because they wanted to humiliate them as much as possible. The Romans were experts at this, and this was a terrible, terrible thing that Jesus had to go through. This total humiliation. Here he is, the king of all creation, being treated like this. It's a horrible thing. Let's look at the last part of this. Did that ask an interesting question here? I'll make sure I talk about this. So many people like to wear a cross to celebrate their relationship with Jesus, right? How do you think a first century person, maybe somebody who lived under Roman occupation, right? How would they react if they saw a cross as a piece of jewelry or decoration?
You'd probably be appalled.
Yeah. It's because to them it's what? An instrument of death, right? So is there any image that you might feel that way in today's culture if you saw? Kind of hard to...
Swastika.
Swastika.
Yeah, that's what
Very
I
good.
was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A German swastika, yes. It could be other maybe instruments of cruelty or something like that you could think of too as well. But those kind of things would shock people if somebody was glorifying that. Just kind of an interesting sidelight. No real point to that question. I couldn't figure that out why they're saying. It's just to bring out the fact that to them the cross at that time was a terrible, terrible thing, and it would be something you'd turn back in horror from. Although there are people that love to see things like that, and that was something they didn't bring up a lot. But in the West, in the early West, if you were caught stealing horses or something like that, they didn't waste any time with you.
They hung you.
They hung you. They might wait for the weekend, so you get a nice group of people out from the town to watch, and they would bring picnic lunches and stuff. It would be an event, and it's kind of a gruesome thing to think. But we see the same thing going on here, because wasn't there people watching this whole thing? Not just people who were concerned about Jesus being killed, but people who wanted to see what was going on. It's kind of when you see there's a big accident, you go on the road and everybody slows down to look. You know, I don't know what they want to see, but it's human nature, of course. So let's look at the second half of those verses. Go ahead and read the second half for me.
Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It was written, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews. Therefore, many of the Jews read this inscription for the place where Jesus was crucified near the city. It was written in Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews were saying to Pilate, "Do not write King of the Jews, but that he said, I am King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written."
Okay, so we know there's quite this interplay between Pilate and the Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders hated Rome, and who was Pilate?
Rome.
The Roman government. He was Rome in front of them, right? So they hated Pilate, and Pilate didn't want to be there. He made that very clear. He considered it beneath him to be there, and he didn't want to be there. But he was there, so he had to deal with these people, and he didn't like it. And we see that from several things in accounts from history about this, that he was not really liked to be there. So he knew why the Jewish people brought Jesus to be killed. He knew it was before envy. He knew that Jesus had done nothing worthy of capital punishment. He tried his best. His wife suffered, and we talked about this last week. I couldn't remember if it was Herod's wife or Pilate's wife, but it was Pilate's wife suffered in a dream because of Jesus. It has nothing to do with this man. But Pilate it was his destiny, because he was Roman. He was the picture of power and authority. And he could not find anything wrong. And one of the things he did in one of the other gospel accounts, it says, he took this basin out in front of everybody, and he took his hands, he put it in the water, and he washed his hands. And he says, I have nothing to do with this. Take him away. It was his symbolic way of saying, there's nothing wrong with this man. You're killing him for your own reasons. Yet he apparently did not have the power to say, no, you're not going to kill him. He was afraid of causing some sort of problem there. But all that to say is he did not like to have to deal with these people, so he did one more thing to tweak them, if you want to use a more contemporary word. One more thing to bug them. And what was it? It was this placard. Every time they killed somebody, Rome did, they would say what the person's crime was on a placard, and they'd stick it on the cross, and they would say this guy was a robber, this guy was a murderer. In this particular case, it said this guy was King of the Jews. They didn't like that. They said, please change it, write it so that it says he said he was King of the Jews. And Pilate said, nope, that's what I've written, and that's the way it's going to stay. And so he, like I said, one more little thing there that Pilate was trying to get after the Jews about. One more thing is they posted it in 3 languages. Why do you think they did that?
To make sure everybody understood.
Yeah. In case there's any doubt why that guy's dying, you could see it's written right there. They wrote it in Hebrew or Aramaic also. Now those are 2 separate languages, but all the Hebrew people spoke Aramaic. So some scholars are saying when it says Hebrew, it means what the Hebrews spoke. Was it really Hebrew or was it Aramaic? Because all the Hebrews spoke Aramaic. We know that. It could have been Hebrew or it could have been the Aramaic language. Also, it was in Latin, which is, of course, the language of Rome, and it was in the universal language of Greek. And why did I say universal? Because when Alexander the Great swept through the known world, he left in his wake the fact all these people spoke Greek. That was part of the thing. He would leave people there to Hellenize. It was called Hellenization. And they would all learn Greek so that there was one language that would unify his whole kingdom. Smart, very smart. But it also helped spread the news of Christ, because now everybody could hear the gospel in a language they could understand. And so it says at the right time Jesus came. You know, we also know that Roman roads were built that connected all the kingdom. So at the right time Jesus came. So the Roman roads and the Greek language allows the known world to know about Jesus. What a fascinating thing that is. You think about how that was used by God. I think it's fascinating. So they were trying to discredit Jesus even when he was dying. Did the Jews know he was king? Did the Jews knew he was Messiah, do you think? That's not, we don't know for sure. This is just a, what do you
They
think?
just
Heather?
knew, those in charge, they just knew he was a threat.
Uh-huh.
But I think some knew, some,
I believe some did too. The reason why is because there's a gospel account where it talks about when Jesus did it, like I think it's a healing, right in front of them. Right in front of the Jewish, they were watching closely. He healed this person who had been, I don't know, born blind or born lame. It's one of those kind of things. And they saw it happen. They knew the scriptures that said Messiah would have this ability to do this. And they ascribed what he did to the devil. They said, it's power of Beelzebub that you're doing this. And Jesus later commented on this, says, this is an unforgivable sin. They know, they have God right in front of them, incarnate, and they're ascribing it to the devil. This cannot be forgiven. And so I think some of them did know, personally. I think some of them realized this person is the Messiah, but we don't want him. He's not the kind of Messiah we want. We want a conquering Messiah. We don't want somebody just going to come and upset the spiritual apple cart around here. We want to keep things the way they're going, so we're going to reject him. So some, I think, did know. Did all of them know? Probably not. Probably not. But I think some probably did as well, because we see that evidence in some of those things there. So when he wrote this on there, here is the King of the Jews. Pilate didn't realize it, probably, but he was writing the truth.
the truth, yeah.
Which is interesting because, remember, I think that's what Pilate said something in response to Jesus. He said, what is the truth? Remember that? And here he has truth right in front of him. He doesn't recognize it. Anyway, so let's look at the next point here. The next point, number 2, is plan. We took a look at raised, and now we're looking at plan. Okay, let's look at these verses in 23 and 24. Who has number 3 for me?
I do.
Oh, go ahead.
Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his outer garments and made 4 parts, a part to every soldier, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, to decide whose it shall be. This was to fulfill the scripture, they divided my outer garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots.
Okay, so one of the perks of being on the execution squad is whatever things that the victim owned, or they could keep. So they divide it up. They'd say, okay, this is for you, this is for you, this is for you, this is for you. Okay, and so they did that process. Now, does that mean they stripped him bare there at the site, or did they actually strip him bare before that and march him through? I don't know. We don't know. Very possibly they did, because that's what they like to do, and they probably had somebody carrying the bundle of his possessions and divide it later. But we don't know. It doesn't tell us. So very well, he could have been stripped at the point of execution. And so they have these things here, and they're dividing them up. It sounds pretty gruesome, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's if you're hanging on the cross and they're down below you, dividing up your garments, it's the last and final insult to the whole thing,
Right.
you know.
Yeah. But it's interesting because they came to one particular garment, and apparently that was a nice thing, and they didn't want to tear it up, right? I mean, they could have cut some rags if they just tore it in half or something, but they didn't want to. And so they decided, well, I know this particular one's a little better than the other stuff he's wearing. We'll gamble for it. We'll cast lots for it. Now, it'd be similar to somebody taking dice and seeing who had the high number through them, right? They had particular things that they cast lots with would come up like yes and no, or black and white, or something like that. It was a real simple type of thing they used. And so they did this to him. Now, this particular piece of clothing, I've heard people say, well, this is like designer clothes. And Jesus shows Jesus had lots of wealth, and he was very powerful. I've heard this in health and wealth people that preach this thing. It doesn't really say that here. It was just an unusual item in the fact that it was seamless in this particular case. It doesn't say it was anything special other than that. And so, I think this was a purpose for this. This purpose was, again, to fulfill prophecy, right? Because it says in one of the verses in our thing, I think, which one is it? Number 4, is it 4?
The book
4.
says.
Yeah, number
in
4.
Exodus.
Who has number 4? Oh, go ahead.
They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots.
Again, they see this as a prophecy of Messiah, what would happen to Messiah again. And Psalms has several things like that. That particular prophecy was being fulfilled right here, in front of them. And anyone who knew the messianic prophecies could see that as well. You were going to say something, Tina? I mean, interrupt.
Oh, I was just gonna say, it talks a little bit about the
Garment?
garment in
Yeah.
the book. They describe it as a linen T-shirt that came down below the knee, and
Yeah.
it had a woven edge like a collar
Mm-hmm.
around the opening so that it would not tear. And it talks about it in Exodus 28:32.
Right, exactly.
So it's just a nice one-piece
It was,
Yeah.
clothing.
and I think it was something that was used also by the high priest, right?
Yes.
Or
it
a
does say
priestly
that.
garment. So again, we see a very interesting thing here. The high priest of all is wearing a garment that's considered of that kind, right? Make sure I didn't miss something here. I think that was it. So anyway, we see that everything was planned by God. Everything was planned, even the fact of fulfilling these prophecies to that degree. It's an amazing thing to see. Let's see. Let's look at number 3 now. I think we had number 3 next. Yeah. For these next verses, I want you to notice the contrast between the soldier's cruelty and Jesus' compassion. And we're going to look at 19 verses 25 through 27. And that should be number 5. And that's me. Yeah, I get this one. It says, therefore the soldiers did these things. But standing by the cross were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus then saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he turned his head, probably, he looked at his disciples and said, behold your mother. It says, from that hour, the disciple took her into his own household. Now, who is this person that Jesus is talking to? Besides, we know Mary, of course. Who's his other disciple? Doesn't say, does it? But we have a clue here, don't we? The disciple whom he loved, standing nearby. Who wrote the Gospel of John again?
John.
John. That's John's way of saying, I was there. I was there. I saw these things. Jesus looked at me. He told me to take care of his mother. Now, there were other siblings in the family, weren't there? Besides Jesus, right? Why do you think maybe Jesus didn't say, hey, James, take care of mom now? See, Jesus was what? The oldest, right? He was the oldest in the family. The rest of his half-brothers and sisters were after him, obviously. So he was making sure, as the oldest, he was doing the right thing. That was that final thing. He was taking care of all these things in his life, the major things that mattered. That was his bucket list, if you want to call it that, right? He was making sure that his mother was taken care of. So interesting, we're talking about that today, because today's what? Mother's Day. Mother's Day. So Jesus was looking at his mom, who was just heartbroken, seeing what's happening to him. But she had compassion. He had compassion on her, and he said, John, I want you to take care of her from now on. And traditionally we hear, that I believe, is that John did that. He took her into his home and he took care of her. Is that important, do you think?
Most definitely. It would have left her a
Destitute?
lot of things. Yeah, destitute's a
Yeah.
good word for it.
Yeah. We don't know if the half-brothers and sisters would have done anything at all to help. We're not sure about that. But Jesus knew one thing. He knew that John, being a believer, John being a disciple, would do that. He would take care of her. He could count on that. He couldn't count on his brothers and sisters. Matter of fact, they tried to not really commit him. That's the wrong word. They tried to say he was not in the right mind, various things like that, at various times. And so he could not trust them to do the right thing, apparently. So 40 days after Jesus was born, he was presented at the temple. Remember that? And Simon was a person at the temple, and he saw this infant Jesus. Simeon, excuse me, I said Simon. Simeon. He prophesied something, And we're going to look at that now. It's number 6. Who is number 6?
That's me again.
Ah, okay.
And Simeon blessed them and said to Mary his mother, Behold, this child is appointed for the fall and rise of many in Israel, and for a sign to be opposed, and a sword will pierce even your own soul, to the end that thoughts from many hearts may be revealed.
So Simeon's telling in a prophetic way here what's going to happen. He sees Mary, he sees the child, he sees Joseph, and he's given a word from God. And he's letting Mary know specifically here that something was going to happen, right? Because he said to the mother, behold, right? This is what's going to happen. He's giving these words. And one of the things he says is most important here is, a sword will pierce even your own soul. Do we see that happening probably to Mary at this point? Yeah. Something like this was happening to Mary. And so Mary was prepared for this a long time ago, but it still wouldn't have really deadened the whole thing. So how did Jesus honor his mother on the cross? Now, this is an interesting thing. We are told in the Bible we are to do what with our parents?
Honor.
Honor them, right? Matter of fact, if I'm not too mistaken, I think there might even be a commandment that deals with that. Right? Now let's look at Exodus 20, verse 12. Who has numbers? Oh, I got number 7. I should have given you this.
Here, I'll
You want
grab it.
to read number 7?
Exodus 20, verse 12. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you.
Now this is a verse with a promise, it says. This is the commandment that has a promise on it. And what is that promise again?
Your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you.
So what it's saying there is that God is going to bless you if you honor your parents. That's the right thing to do. If it was so important for God to make sure that Moses saw that in the 10 Commandments, this is the 5th, I think it's the 5th commandment?
I think so.
I think so. If that was so important, can we see now why Jesus took the time to do this? Very important, isn't it? And I would say almost it could be considered prophetic, even looking forward to what this event is happening, right? Anyway, not me stretching a little bit. But anyway, as the oldest son, Jesus was responsible to care for his mother, who was likely widowed by this time. Jesus may have given John the task of caring for his mother Mary because of his half-siblings had not yet placed their faith in him. And he probably, like I said, wanted to make sure that she was taken care of the right way. And John would do that. And he wasn't sure about his own brothers and sisters, which is a sad thing.
Which James in the New Testament church,
Yes.
who was put to death, that was the disciple James, not the brother James.
The James that was leader of the Jerusalem church, they believe, was a half-brother.
Was that yeah, so he was put to death. And so it also could be Jesus, again, thinking about what's going to happen to James
That's
and
true.
Jude and the others.
That's true.
Who, traditionally speaking, who lived the longest of the disciples.
Which one was that?
It was John.
Oh, that's right, John.
And so, presumably, again,
Yes.
he's perhaps relieving a burden from his brothers.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I thought about that earlier, and it skipped my mind, but that was, he knew who would be around the longest for Mary. Of course. What's that? Duh. Good point. Anything else that you see about this? I think very appropriate, by the way, Mother's Day today, and we're going through these verses, specifically this particular one. Yeah. He was doing the right thing for his mom. Let's see. Let's look at the last one. Finished, it's called. And verses 28 through 30. For these last 3 verses, I want you to note how these verses point towards Jesus' humanity, his humanity. Who has number 9? Oh, I do again.
Should have grabbed that when I was over there.
Well, did you have... Oh, no, I forgot Ephesians 6:2.
Which says, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise.
So it's echoing the 5th commandment. I'm sorry about that. You want to read number 9?
Sure, I mean, you've been reading.
I don't care.
Sure, I mean,
I'll give it out, sure.
I like moving.
So, note these things that talk about Jesus' humanity here.
John 19, 28 to 30. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things had already been accomplished to fulfill the scripture, said, I am thirsty. A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the sour wine upon a branch of hyssop and brought it up to his mouth. Therefore, when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit.
So that even in his death, he was in charge. He was sovereign. Isn't that interesting? I think it's fascinating, personally, to see all these things coming together like this. In our lesson book, it talks a little bit about the sponge of vinegar.
Oh, yeah, I was reading
And,
that.
and to be quite honest, I've read other commentaries, and I have this must be an outlier comment. I've never seen this before. And so I say that ahead of time to let you know that I'm not sure this is really necessarily the right idea, but it could have been. It doesn't say, and I think if it had been, they would have said more about it. Anyway, all that to say, it's the Greek word translated finished. Okay, that is a word that they would say like on a bill. They'd stamp telestai. I think it was a Greek or something like that.
More or less, yeah.
It means paid in full. What you owe is now gone. It's been paid in full. So when he said those words, that's what he was saying. It's done. It's finished. I've done it. I've paid for all of it. It says, only the Son of God could complete, and this is page 106 and 107, I'm reading this. Only the Son of God could complete that was necessary for our forgiveness. He was the only person who's qualified, right? Jesus understood one prophetic word was yet to be fulfilled in stating he was thirsty. Jesus not only spotlighted his humanity, but also fulfilled Psalm 69:3 and 20 through 21, which talks about that, by the way, in a prophetic way too. The drink the soldiers gave Jesus was a watered-down vinegar or cheap wine. And before that, by the way, and I meant to say this, before that, they offered him, I think it was gall, it was called. It was something to deaden the pain, but it would also sometimes cause you to live a little longer because you could withstand the thing. And so they were very, very horrible people, the Romans, when it comes to execution. They wanted this to go as long as possible. They wanted to prolong the agony, and they were experts at this. And so, but he refused that. Remember that? But this other thing here, he said, I'm thirsty. And they got a hyssop stalk with a sponge stuck on the end, dipped it in a sour wine, vinegar type stuff, and went up to him to get it to him. Now, a lot of people wonder, how can you do that? A hyssop stalk is not very long. Well, that's because you see in your mind pictures of Jesus being crucified, and you see what?
Way up there.
That's not the way it was. They know that these accounts were talked about, and he was just off the ground just enough, probably no more than a foot or two, if that, maybe just inches. We don't know exactly, but we know it wasn't really high because they didn't want to spend a lot of effort and time to hoist this person way up high. They wanted him just up high enough to do the job. So you could easily take a stick like that and reach up to somebody's mouth to do that. And they're saying here in this particular commentary here that this was not an act of compassion necessarily, but of contempt and ridicule. They said this sponge could have been used in a latrine type of situation, and this was a final insult to Christ. Now, I've never seen that before. Anybody seen that before? So I'm not sure where they get that from. So I'm going to say that's an outlier. It's that view. I think somebody heard him say that, and there was people around that did care about him, and they were trying to help him out. Nothing says contrary to that here, and this is probably something they were doing to help Jesus. I'm just that's my thought, because they knew he was about to die. And at this point, your tongue is like stuck to your roof of your mouth. You're struggling for every breath you can get, and they knew that he needed this little extra thing. So, but this could have been what they're saying. They could have did it for further mocking of him in this way. I don't know. Anyway, but after this, he fulfilled Scripture, and he realized, I have finished my bucket list. Right? The bucket list was done. He had done what he needed, and he said, it is finished. And he gave up his own life. And at the very end, we see that he was sovereign over all things, even the death of his mortal body, right? And that final declaration tells us. So, any comments or questions about that struck you in these verses? Again, we see this was prophesied that he would thirst. It was prophesied that this would happen, and it's fulfilled as well. It's neat to see that kind of thing happening. There's a great hymn of the church called At the Cross, and I do want to finish it. We're almost done out of time, But this hymn is quite interesting. It's on your handouts. It's the last page. You may or may not be familiar with this. Sometimes people today don't know hymns as well as they used to. But Isaac Watts wrote this in 1707. What's interesting is Isaac Watts was a minister. He wrote a lot of poems and hymns to go with his sermons. Very prolific person, apparently. He wrote apparently more than 600 hymns, and I didn't realize that he did. He's sometimes referred to as the father of English hymns. This particular song, At the Cross, influenced another person. Early in her life, Fanny Crosby, at 6 weeks of age, she had an infection in her eyes and she lost her sight. So for the vast majority of her life, she was blind. Fanny Crosby was saved listening to this song, apparently, is what the story goes. And she became one of the most prolific writers in Christian history. Apparently between 8,000 and 9,000 hymns.
Wow.
And poetries and books. She's blind. Did you see the influence this person had? Talking about the cross of Jesus. Just that part there just encourages me to see that. She wrote so many hymns that she had to use pseudonyms, fake names, because people wouldn't put them in their books because she already had too many hymns in there. I didn't know that. But lots of neat songs by Fanny J. Crosby. Anyway, At the Cross. So we're going to finish with this. And we're just going to do, let's see, we don't have time to do all the verses, but let's just do a couple of verses here. Let's do the first and last verse. So if you know it, you can sing along with me. Hopefully I'll be able to hit the notes okay. Alas, and did my Savior lead, and did my Sovereign die? Would he devote that sacred head for sinners such as I? At the cross, where I first saw the light, and the burden of my heart rolled away. It was there by faith I received my sight, and now I am happy all the day. But drops of grief can ne'er repay the debt of love I owe. Here, Lord, I give myself away, 'tis all that I can do. At the cross, where I first saw the light, and the burden of my heart rolled away. It was there by faith I received my sight, and now I am happy all the day. Can you see how this would influence Fanny J. Crosby?
Oh, yeah.
Can you see that? I first saw the light. I received my sight, and now I'm happy all day. She's in heaven right now with sight. Isn't that a great thing? Now, one point I want to say on the first verse, you may or may not know this, but they rewrote this verse, and there's a reason they did. It says, would he devote that sacred head for sinners such as I? Used to say, for such a worm as I. And the reason why is we misunderstand that word now. It didn't mean we're all worms, but it does mean we were all doing things that were like wormy. we were sinners, right? And so because
speaking, we were worms.
Because it's misunderstood, that's why. Now, I'm not in favor of that, but that's what they did, and that's why, in case you wonder. Any comments or questions? All right, I spent a little over time. I apologize. Let's have a word of prayer and be dismissed. Dear Father, thank you so much for this time of study, Lord, on this most important thing, and how you sacrificed your life, how you paid the debt in full. There's nothing left to do. You did it all, and we can't add anything to that, Lord. Thank you so much. Help us as we go through life. We come with these opportunities to share this important truth with others, Lord. In your Son's name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you for being here today. I sure appreciate it. And I hope you found this an interesting lesson. I sure did. Whenever I study for a study like this, I always learn so much more. I don't know about you guys. Fascinating. So you guys are dismissed. You can go upstairs. And this is Grace Baptist Church. We're online right now. Forgot to mention that to you. We're online. This is Grace Baptist Church, the Adult One Bible Study. And my name is Norm Ellis. And I want you to stand by the same YouTube channel because Pastor Matthew is going to be preaching later. And we also have a guest speaker for a little bit. Scott from Options 360 is going to be speaking to us. So looking forward to that as well. Thank you for being with us. God bless you all.
Thank you, Norm.
Okay, we're off the air. Thank you guys. I appreciate it.